I'm Cathal Summers,
And I'm Deirdre Glynn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors, and you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
On this episode, Teagasc Soil and Plant Nutrition Specialist Mark Plunkett joins us to talk about the benefits of cover crops as a management tool in a tillage system, both environmentally and for production.
What benefits do cover crops bring to the table in relation to soil functions? Does the benefit outweigh the cost on the farm? With nitrogen and phosphorus being a pressure in our rivers and estuaries, how can cover crops help to address this issue?
I started off by asking Mark how the tillage crops are doing this year.
I suppose, look, in terms of winter crops, they're looking reasonably well, Deirdre. Crops look to have good yield potential. In terms of spring crops, then look, I suppose it's been a tricky year. April was very cold, May was very wet, and June has been very dry. And in July we're getting some rain again. But look, spring crops look reasonably good. There looks to be good yield potential out there. But I suppose on saying that, it's not until the combine really arrives before we can get a real measure of how crops look. But I'd be positive at this stage that we'll have a good harvest for 2021.
I suppose the next thing, Mark, then when the crop, we're starting to think towards harvesters coming in now in the next, especially in spring crops, I suppose, in the next month, 6 weeks. And farmers, I suppose, are wondering what to do next. We're looking, we need to have green cover out after we harvest our crops. But I suppose we're very interested from the environmental side and production side on cover cropping. And the first thing I'll say to you is there's a lot of talk about cover crops, Mark, but can you tell me maybe what is the difference between a catch crop, a cover crop, a fodder crop, and there's so many names there. Can you just explain what's the difference between all these kind of crops?
Yeah, I suppose there is some new, I suppose, names out there like cover crops, even green crops, and you've mentioned cash crops or fodder crops. But I suppose that a cover crop, Cathal, is generally a crop between two main tillage crops. So say between two main crops of spring barley, and I suppose the main function of that cover crop is to take up nutrients or reduce nutrient loss, or any nutrients that are there from, say, the current crop. It'll pick them up, and again, there's soil and environmental benefits. While on the other hand, then a cash crop or a fodder crop is slightly different. That there is a fodder demand or a fodder need on the farm over the winter period. So these tend to be things like fodder rape or kale that go in, I suppose, as soon as possible. And I suppose the aim here is to maximize dry matter production to meet that fodder requirement over the winter period. And I suppose the big differentiation between a cover crop and a fodder crop is that a fodder crop tends to have a fertilizer requirement. So there's a requirement there for NP and K to drive that sufficient winter feed for the winter period. But fodder crops do bring benefits, as I said, in terms of soil benefits, and also environmental benefits. From improving soil fertility to improving soil structure to reducing nutrient loss, similar to the cover crop. So hopefully, Cathal, that explains the difference between a cover crop and a fodder crop.
Yeah, so the cover crop and the catch crop are more or less the same thing, and then the fodder crop and the cash crop are kind of the same. One thing just picked up there when you're talking about the fodder crop, Mark, and look, this would be common enough. Like I'm down here in Wexford, and we would, once the crop is harvested, and if a cover crop goes in, you'd often maybe see sheep coming in there in December to graze, or maybe cattle or whatever. But it can be a little bit risky, I suppose, if we think we're on free draining soils. And you mentioned there that if you are putting in a fodder crop, you generally put in maybe some NP and K on it. Do we have to be careful, Mark? Because we know, I suppose, if growth rates are not good in the back end of the year when the crop goes in, can it be a bit risky? Do we have to be careful in what we put onto it?
Well, I suppose it's very much it's very much around sowing date, and I suppose the earlier the crops can be sown, Cathal, the better utilization or the better the uptake of the fertilizer applied. So yes, if you're trying to grow a big fodder crop, again, it would be important to sow it as early as possible, and then adjust your fertilizer application rates based on what you expect to grow. And I suppose that's nearly as that you're putting out enough to grow the tons of dry matter that's required over the winter period.
Yeah, and I think from an environmental point of view, we'd be hoping that people would put in the crops and maybe incorporate them back in. But like if they are grazing, I suppose, Mark, would it be important maybe if you're putting a crop down, to ensure that the crops are not near rivers and drains, and maybe there's a bit of a buffer zone there, just to be careful once they're grazed that nothing washes away?
Yeah, look, it is very, very important that, when you're grazing those cover crops, that I suppose you're conscious of ground conditions and weather conditions, and that, you have a run back area. And again, that, you leave adequate, as you say, buffer, by streams to reduce the risk of, heavy soil or nutrients moving into that water course. So, yeah, look, it is important to be conscious to reduce issues around nutrient loss to water at that time of the year.
Yeah, buffers will be very, very important, especially in slopey ground as well. So to increase the buffer, say up to about 5 meters where you have a particularly steep slope,
Yeah.
that would be quite important as well. Mark,
Okay.
should you really view cover crops as a long-term investment that gradually improves your management in multiple areas, like in terms of compaction and infiltration? So why should a farmer sow a cover crop? Would there be multiple benefits?
Yeah, look, Deirdre, it's a very good question. Look, I think there's many, many benefits, like in terms of the soil. I see cover crops as they protect the soils over the winter period. They're near like a large umbrella that, again, from, heavy rainfall events, that there's a cover or a cover or protection on the soil. Again, in terms of soil structure, there's many benefits there in terms of having an active root system, that you have a crop actually growing in the soil. It also reduces the risk of soil erosion. It also improves soil health. So again, in terms of the biology, the earthworms, the bacteria, the fungi, it also reduces the risks, reduces pest diseases and weeds. So you have an actively growing crop there. And I suppose something that's pretty new is that it's capturing carbon. So again, it's bringing carbon, organic matter back into our soils. And again, that's providing a food source for the biology and the earthworms. It also will improve things like soil fertility. And most importantly, it'll reduce the potential loss of nutrients to water courses. So look, there's many benefits there, and there's also yield benefits. Again, results are variable coming from Oak Park in terms of increasing yields, but there is benefits there in terms of the long term, that you're improving soil structure, you're improving soil health, you're keeping an actively growing crop in the soil for a full 12 months of the year. And as I said, there's many benefits there on that front.
We might dig into more of the benefits now in a few minutes, Mark, but just one question, I suppose, before we go too far. You have to listen off a number of benefits there, and they are massive benefits. The one thing I would see over the past number of years, probably farmers more inclined to put in these type of crops if they're in gloss or something like that, or if there's kind of some form of payment or something for it. And I suppose we need to try and go down the route of that. These crops can give huge amount of benefits to production and to, I suppose, like Deirdre said, down the line, how well your farmland will do. But first thing a farmer is going to ask me when I go on to farmers, what cover crop would you sow? Like, would you recommend any specific one, Mark, or what are people kind of sowing, or is it a mixture, or is it a single crop, or what would we put in?
Yeah, I suppose, look, there's quite a range of stuff there, and I suppose it's very much down, Cathal, to what you want to spend. Like, you know what I mean? You can go, I suppose, some of the lower cost things are like some mustard is quite cheap. Like I said, the fodder rape is quite cheap. The stubble turnip tends to be to get a bit more expensive. So I suppose it depends. Like, like what do you want to use it for? Is it purely for mopping up any nutrients that are there, or is there I suppose, do you want to graze that with livestock? As I said, the brassicas, like, they're relatively cheap to grow very, very fast. I suppose just be careful around rotation. There can be, if you things like, say, I'd see the rape or beet in the rotation, just to be conscious of that, or potatoes. Then I suppose there's likes of the Facelia, which is more expensive. You're up on maybe €8-9 a kilo. Again, it's a small seed, can be difficult to spread, but it's an excellent break. So again, from a rotational point of view, it's very, very good on that front, and it's also easier to incorporate. I suppose in terms of legumes and like the vetches, they're an option as well. Peas, beans, they have the potential to fix nitrogen and reduce chemical nitrogen rates. But I suppose seed is not that expensive, but the seeding rate tend to be high. And again, they tend to be a good break in terms of diseases and pests. Mightn't be so good in terms of nitrate leaching, because they will fix a nice bit of nitrogen during the growing season, and will reduce the following crop's nitrogen requirement as well. And I suppose there's other things there as well, Cathal, things like oats and rye. Again, they're a larger seed, they're easier to broadcast, but I suppose just be conscious that you do need seed cover. But again, they're an option in terms of getting a green cover, or trying to protect the soil or reduce nutrient loss for the remainder of the growing season.
Sorry, the legumes are good at fixing nitrogen, but they're not great at scavenging the nutrients then.
Well, yeah, well, I suppose they will scavenge to a degree. Like if you're to look at the work from Oak Park there, like they can, capture up to maybe something like 80 kilograms of N per hectare in a short time, and also then reduce the crops following nitrogen requirement.
I suppose the trick you're probably thinking, Deirdre, and it's crossed my mind as well. If you're putting legumes in say into August and you're sowing them down, you're producing some nitrogen if it comes up, and potentially if you're in free drain soils, you get a nitrogen.
The leaching potential, yeah.
Potential, so I have to be a bit careful. But the one thing I would see around here a bit is there's a lot of leafy turnip and forage rape being sowed, and they're brassicas, Mark, and they're aggressive growers and they establish quickly. But can there be an issue with say clubroot and stuff there if you don't rotate correctly?
Yeah, from a rotation point of view, I suppose if you've oilseed rape in the rotation, or maybe potatoes or beet, there can be, I suppose, hosts for some diseases. So again, I suppose just to be conscious of that. But there is other options there. Maybe in some like a psyllium mix, or maybe some of the cereals in terms of the oats.
Triticale might be good. Yeah.
Possibly, yeah. Triticale could be an option either, Deirdre, absolutely, yeah.
I'm cheating here now at the moment, but I'm looking at a document in front of me. But psyllium looks like a really good option especially for reducing nitrate leaching and suppressing weeds as well. So it looks and it establishes quite well. So that's a good option.
It's easy to incorporate as well. Then to follow, and come the springtime, it's easy to take that out. Compared to something like mustard. Mustard can grow. It's very aggressive. It can grow quite rapidly. A very good scavenger for nitrogen, but you can have a big bulk or a big volume that you need to break down.
Mark, considering the balance between, say, cost-effective establishment and appropriate seedbed conditions for a catch crop, how and when should we establish in terms of seeding rate, the cost, and the rotation, if you have your rotation in mind?
Well, I suppose in terms of establishment, look, Deirdre, you're trying to get in as soon as possible, or once that field is cleared, once the straw is removed, you're trying to get in there as early as possible, say late August, early September, and the sooner you get it sown, the better. Like the later you go into September, growth falls off, the conditions are not as good. So I'd say early sowing is very, very important. Again, in terms of establishment, look, you're generally looking at a light cultivation, or there is some drills out there that will cultivate and sow in a single operation. And I suppose then down to the seed mix, you know what I mean? I'd say you can go, quite, I suppose cheap and cheerful in terms of the fodder rapes or the mustards, depending on your rotation. And then, maybe some of the more expensive ones in terms of the Vasilias or the legumes, depending on what you want to get out of it, or maybe something like an oat rye mix. So I suppose them are the things to consider. But for me, early sowing, going in as soon as possible and having good seedbed conditions. I think rolling after sowing as well, very, very important, especially if your weather is forecast to dry thereafter.
Mark, do you feel that min-till has helped with cover crops with less disturbance of clay and that going forward?
Yeah, look, it absolutely, like these are small seeds, like they're very small seeds, like your mustard, your fodder rape, your clovers, your phacelias. They're quite small. The radish is a little bit bigger. The what else is there? The vetch is a little bit bigger, and then your oats, your buckwheat a little bigger. Like, so, yeah. Look, you don't need a lot really. Like Deirdre, like you're only talking maybe cultivating the top, inch or two of soil. So again, something like a min-till, a stubble grubber, or I'd say there is drills out there now that will cultivate and sow in the one operation. I think they do a super job. Now they are more expensive. You're talking maybe, you're talking typical sowing rates for that type of an operation, but it's a one pass. You're cultivating and sowing the one run, and you're getting a very, you're getting a very accurate seed rate, number one, and also then you're getting a very precise placement of the seed. So from my experience, it is a little more expensive, but it's a very good way of establishing the cover crop with minimum soil disturbance. So you do reduce the risk of, soil erosion or losing, say, phosphorus through particulate P in terms of runoff, etc. Yeah, so as little soil disturbance as possible. and also from cost point of view, like, you know what I mean, you're trying to keep it as low cost as
Keep it to a minimum.
possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
You're in out there quick as well.
absolutely, yeah.
You made a real important point there, Mark. Trying to establish that cover crop quickly after harvest. And I remember in 2020 last year, if you remember back, we had a kind of around harvest time, it got wet and the harvest pushed back a little bit. And I know by the time the crops got sown around here, even they didn't come that well over the winter, because that few weeks that were lost, that were pushed back to the normal date, that has a huge impact, Mark, does it? That little, even a few weeks.
Yeah, like even like, yeah, like, you know what I mean, probably a day in August could be worth maybe possibly a week in September, like, you know what I mean. So the sooner you can get those seeds into the ground when soils are warm, you know, every day earlier the better, like, because those seeds will strike in maybe, you know, 3-4 days they'll be up. And also, like, you know, consolidation, I think, is very, very important, you know, especially after sowing, like as you were describing there last year, Cathal. You know, we had 2 storms in was it July and August. It was very wet. The harvest was looking very, very tricky. And then it got very dry in September. Yeah, so again, you know, getting those crops established as soon as possible and having, I suppose, everything right, is very, very important to get them up and running as quick as possible. Like, you know.
Mark, in 2018 we had the reverse scenario.
That's right.
In July and August we had a drought situation. We had drought conditions.
Yeah.
How are the cover crops a viable option then with a drought scenario?
Well, I suppose it depends when the drought is. Like, if it comes very dry after sowing, you'll get poor establishment. But if you remember, in 2018 we had an early harvest. We probably cut spring barley probably maybe a fortnight, 3 weeks earlier than normal. And again, that gave us a very early window then to get in with cover crops. So like we were probably sowing cover crops in the first 2 weeks in August, which meant that you had, my memories of 18 was that anyone that sowed cover crops early, they were very well established and there was good covers going into the winter period. So they're what you would like, but we don't always get
what we want.
those type of conditions. But look, I suppose if it comes dry in September, that can be a challenge then, because, you know what I mean, if they don't get up and running, you're suddenly into October and you'll have very, very little then. And again, in terms of their function or their role in terms of, you know, reducing nutrient loss and protecting the soil is diminished, or they're not as beneficial as you would like. But you know,
the other option, I suppose, Mark, is natural regeneration. Just see some lads doing that. You have to get a green cover out there. What's your opinion on that? Is just let it grow back, or give it a scratch, or what do you think lads should do?
Again, look, it's not as good as a cover crop from a nitrate leaching point of view, Cathal, but look, it's not far behind. Like, so again, look, if you get in again and give the stubbles a light cultivation, and I suppose, you know, get volunteers or any seeds that come out the back of the combine, or maybe there's a weed problem there, you know, depending. I suppose it very much depends on, I suppose, the seed weed bank that's in the soil. So again, you know, once you cultivate that stubbles, like, you know, there was if you remember back in 2020 with the 2 storms, there was some crops, there was quite a number of heads in the ground, and again, there was enough seed there to, you know, generate sufficient green cover to reduce things like nitrate leaching, and, you know, was a benefit in terms of improving soil structure, soil health. Like, so again, definitely natural regeneration has a role to play.
Cathal and I are very interested in water quality, and I suppose phosphorus loss will be a big issue where you don't have natural regeneration, or you don't have cover crops in situ over the winter period.
I suppose the only risk there is that you are possibly promoting a green bridge. That's the only thing I'm just thinking here now, that in terms of disease carryover, like, you know what I mean, that's the only risk. And I suppose that's the benefit of putting in an actual cover crop. Let the seed cost, you know, but I suppose that's the only risk, I suppose, that is there, guys, is that you are creating a green bridge between the old crop and the new crop come the springtime. So, but I know you can look at that, can be taken out as well, you know, come the 1st of December or early January, that can be burnt off and removed. But I suppose that would be a benefit for maybe putting in something like a mustard, or some of the fodder rapes, or the leafy turnips, or maybe spending a bit more on the likes of some of the vetches, or the phacelias, or the buckwheats, or, maybe something like oats or rye could be an option, like, you know what I mean? So there's plenty there on the menu. But I suppose just to be conscious of that green bridge.
Yeah, and look,
And
any tillage farmers know the advantage of rotations, and crop rotations are huge benefits, and on the disease front as well. The other thing you mentioned, Mark, and I liked it earlier on, and Deirdre just mentioned phosphorus loss. And uh, if we ever see that brown water going out the gate in the winter, that's that's some of our best soil going
yeah,
out, and our phosphorus with it. But you mentioned the cover crops acting like a bit of an umbrella over the winter period.
yeah, absolutely. Like when it rains now, like it does rain, like we get a lot of rain in a very short period of time. So, like, in that window, say when the crop is cut till the following spring, like it tends to be the wettest time of the year. So by putting in a cover crop there, you're sort of protecting the soil, or when the rain falls, that it's hitting the cover crop as opposed to the soil. So it reduces the risk of the loss of that brown water, or the loss of phosphorus, or the loss of soil. So yeah, look, I think even for that alone, putting something in over the winter period to protect soils, you have a root system there, it's actively growing. You're it's really when you go to plow those soils the following springtime, you start to see the benefit that the ground comes up, with a lovely crummy structure, from having an actively growing crop in that window when it's generally fallow. So having something in the stubble actively growing within reason, and trying to manage it then is beneficial, absolutely beneficial.
Yeah, and
But
we're up the plough match there. It was 90 now since we're at one, was it? But remember we had the soil pit dug there in front of the Teagasc pit, in front of the Teagasc tent, and we had a cover crop growing on it beside a grass crop, and we dug a profile beside it so farmers could actually see the roots structure and the root
yeah,
system, Mark. And I
yeah,
know you're very into this stuff. From the nitrate leaching point of view and all the other stuff, like that the difference in the cover crop roots are mad, aren't they? The thicknesses and the lengths, and you're talking about scavenging nitrogen. That stuff, they're so aggressive, they'll soak up everything around it, won't they?
yeah. Well, they can scavenge, or they can pull out anywhere between 20 and 60 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Like, so there is a big benefit there to
It's
having
huge, huge.
an actively growing crop in the soil, like, you know what I mean, from
Yeah.
absolutely, like, and that's where they work, or that's where they
And the
function, like,
counter to that, Mark, is if you're saying that like they can suck up that kind of 60 to 80 kilos, the counter to that is if we don't have them in there, that 60 to 80 kilos could be gone into the water, down to the groundwater. So I think that's a key point. Like if we don't do something going forward, we know we have a nitrogen problem, in particular in the southeast of the country. If we don't look after this side of the house, we're only going to compound that problem. We know nitrogen use efficiency is quite good on the tillage side, but it can be improved with these additional type of crops, which yes, there may be a cost, but the benefits are huge from them.
yeah. Like you're adding, I suppose, you're, like, you know what I mean, you're putting a crop in there to mop up, like tillage crops are probably 60-70% nitrogen efficient, like, you know what I mean, but there's still another 25-30% kicking around there. So that's the idea of the cover crop, that it'll actually mop up that, or suck up that nitrogen, and it'll put it back into the system for the crop in 2022. Like, so I suppose that's the big benefit. And obviously the benefit then that it doesn't go into a water course, like, so so yeah, absolutely. Like, and like even natural regeneration, it'll pull up, anything from 15 to 20 kilos of nitrogen, like, you know what I mean. So having something there to mop it up is very, very beneficial, and reduces that risk, or that load of nitrate going into water, like,
Mark, you and I have dug holes all over the country looking at soil, and we saved the best to last. But the soil structure, Mark, this is something that I think people are starting to understand now on farms. It's hugely important. I don't always, when I'm out on a farm, I don't necessarily mention soil structure. I often say compaction, but we know that it relates. Uh, these cover crops, and Deirdre mentioned which ones would be best, but like when you get in those different root systems, they do serious good work on the structure side, don't they?
yeah. Look, as we're talking, firstly, Carl, I suppose it's they protect the soil, and that umbrella effect on the soil. And I suppose secondly then is that you have an actively growing root system there. It's vigorously growing. It's improving soil structure. It's pulling the particles, the sand that lay together in terms of aggregate or crumb structure. And as I was saying earlier, it tends to be very evident then when you go plow those soils. Like, the experience is that they tend to be drier. You know what I mean? Because there's an actual structure there. There's a network of in terms of drainage, it's better on those soils. Like that tends to be the experience that they tend to drain better or dry out quicker in the springtime when it comes to establishing the next crop. And I suppose the other big thing then as well is that it's a source of organic matter. During that time of the year, you're capturing carbon from the air, you're pulling it into soil, and you're also reducing carbon leakage or carbon loss from those soils if they were bare over the winter period. And again, organic matter, again, it's the natural glue in the soil that, again, it's very important in terms of soil structure. It gives the soil structure itself, and it gives soils the ability to carry big loads in terms of machinery during the growing season.
Yeah, and from me looking at soils over the last number of years, to me, on the long-term tillage side of the house, I suppose certainly organic matter is the biggest threat, I think, for tillage, because anyone that's in tillage every year on, we don't have that supply of dung that we used to have that we could put out on tillage crops anymore. And we're not getting the organic matter back in, and you can see it as well. And even if you do an earthworm count in a tillage field versus a grass field, it's startling how poor the earthworms and the biodiversity is in the soil. I think organic matter build-up is a big one. I know straw chopping is coming back on board there at the moment with schemes, but I think cover crops surely, Mark, has a massive role to play there as well.
Oh, look, absolutely. Like, and I haven't touched on things like soil fertility. Like, as you said, you're putting a food source on the plate for earthworms, for what I mean. And also organic matter, it's a source of NPK and sulfur and micronutrients. And on the carbon side, like, what I mean, these crops are taking carbon out of the air. They can fix somewhere in the region of 1 to 1.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Also reducing carbon loss over the winter period, and also reducing things like nitrous oxide. So on the environmental front, yes, cover crops are very, very beneficial, and they bring a lot to the story, really, in terms of improving soil organic matter and carbon capture on tillage farms.
And I suppose also as a soil green manure.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd say, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and like you're right, Deirdre, that green manure that you disc back in or you plow back in, whatever way you get back in, that'll break down. And again, we're relying on our microbes, our microbiology to break that material down. So we need to feed them as well. So it'll break down that material and release nutrients over time for us. So I think, look, Mark, with soil health being one of the main pillars in the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, I think the benefit of cover cropping certainly outweighs the cost. I think it's every farmer should be considering this. Every tillage farmer should be considering what the benefit can do to the farm. So with that, Mark, thank you very much.
No bother at all.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Mark Plunkett, Teagasc Soil and Plant Nutrition Specialist, for joining us on the show.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.